Hey guys, Matt here with Code Tech Tutorials. Today we're going to look at Bungie's C++ guidelines and razors. Now this is just going to be a quick overview. The article is quite long. You're welcome to go read it. I'll show right there is where you can find it. Also, if you just Google search it, you'll find it. It just came out very recently, a few days ago. I'm going to start out here just by reading the top blurb, and then we're just going to basically do a synopsis overview. And this is just for people who don't feel like reading it all basically, or if they just kind of want my take of the whole thing. And it is how you would expect. Of course, Bungie makes Destiny 2. They've made a ton of other games, pretty famous and big game developer. Alright, here we go. There's a lot of teamwork and ingenuity that goes into making a game like Destiny. We have talented people across all disciplines working together to make the best game we can. However, achieving a level of coordination needed to make Destiny isn't easy. It's like giving a bunch of people paintbrushes, but only one canvas to share between them and expecting a high quality portrait at the end. In order to make something that isn't pure chaos, some ground rules need to be agreed upon. Alright, so pretty decent little intro. Alright, so they have coding guidelines. Now this is pretty standard. Almost every company that has a big piece of software that a bunch of people work on, there's always coding guidelines. So they talk a little bit about this here. Here are some of the things they say. Alright, so don't use the static keyword directly. Now I thought this was pretty interesting. So basically they have a header and they have a static global and a static local. And it allows us to audit dangerous static functions efficiently. Now if you're not sure what that means, I would encourage you to maybe learn a little more about the static, or I might actually do a video in my C++ series about that. All right, and they mentioned some other things. Now, some of these things are sort of odd to me that they're so specific, like braces on their own lines. Braces are always placed on a line by themselves. This is not a big deal in my opinion at all, and not something that should be critically analyzed as a big deal. All right, now they have an exception for single line inline function definitions. Okay, fine. There's got to be something more important that they can mention other than braces on their own lines, I was thinking. But okay, so they have a tool to auto check and auto fix easily identifiable guideline violations. I think this is pretty standard too. So let's go down a little bit and read a little more. Challenges, you say. The first challenge is the programming language that we're using for game development. C++ is a powerful high-performance language that straddles the line between modern concepts and old school principles. All right. Well, it's one of the most common choices for AAA game dev to pack the most computations in the smallest amount of time. All right, very good. So let's move forward a little bit. They say some of their code is 20 years old, and some of it needs to be deleted or updated. All right, so they have about 150 engineers at this point, and about 75 of them are working on the C++. Okay, so a lot of this is just kind of write up. Not a whole lot of technical stuff in here. They kind of allude to some technical stuff, but this is more of like more of a general public post that kind of tries to give a little insight into what it's like there, even if you don't understand the language they're talking about. So that's one thing I kind of gathered. Okay, so they have this concept of razors. Which they basically mean shaving off complexity, or to cut off stuff you don't need, keep everything really straightforward, favor understandability at the expense of time to write. So every line of code will be read many times by the people, many varying backgrounds. Prefer explicit but verbose to concise but implicit. Okay, that's a lot to make. Explicit but verbose. I guess that'd be like long function names that maybe are very clear, and long, maybe longer variable names that are very clear about what they are just by the variable name. I always find it frustrating to go into a new code base and everything's an acronym and you're like, how am I supposed to figure out what this is? That is always a bit frustrating. Sure, you can usually eventually figure it out, especially if there's good comments and a good write-up about it. Then it looks like they do snake case as their naming convention. Another thing, so you can find like arguments online and forums and threads about naming convention cases and tabs versus spaces, and these are all essentially the most pointless and useless bits of time eatery when it comes to programming. You could be learning about something, a new concept instead, or something. It just doesn't matter is the point. It really has no bearing on anything what your naming convention is, or your tab space convention, or if you put your opening brackets on a new line or not. That doesn't mean that it's not important to have those, because you want everybody writing code the same way. That way it is basically uniform and easier to read quickly. If it ever comes up as like an argument and someone says, no, we do it this way, and then someone else says, no, we do it this way, it's a useless argument. Just pick one and move on. That's all there is to it. So maybe take a vote or something. Names and code syntax, it all gets abstracted away once it's compiled. None of that translates into the final machine code. No matter how you do your naming convention, it does not affect the performance or anything like that. You probably already know this, but just to make it very clear. Just tell me which one you prefer for your code base. Okay, let's move on. Then avoid abbreviation. Yes, we already kind of touched on this. Encourage the addition of helpful inline comments. It's fine. I think what they mean by inline is you don't put them above the thing or below the thing. You just put them to the right side, start a comment, and say the thing to the right of it. I think that's what they mean by inline. I've never heard a comment called inline before, but that makes sense. All right, below is a snippet of their code. You can probably get a sense of what it's trying to do. Let's check out the code. All right, int32, new held milliseconds. All right, very descriptive name. Oh, what? They don't use a space before their equal sign here? That's really weird to me. All right, well, this is nice because this is very clear that it's the new held milliseconds. Often the scariness of using the word new is it can occasionally look like you're creating a new pointer or something, or assigning a pointer some new data. But obviously it's not the case here. So some people entirely avoid the word new, but they don't seem to care about that. Because when you're like doing a code search for the word new, you want to find where you're allocating memory, right? And this would pop up in there. So some people avoid that in their code bases, but then, yeah, they seem to be okay with that. Or they probably do it differently. They probably don't use new and delete too much anymore. They probably have it abstracted differently. All right, so they call an update context. Their update context, which is probably like since the last frame, I'm guessing. Get timestamp millisecond, and then minus. This is a member start hold timestamp millisecond. It's like the last time, I think. So it's basically the delta time is what this looks like. All right, and then they have some more stuff. I guess we don't really need to go over all this, but they're called. Let's analyze a few things though. They're calling a function called set output property value and accumulate. Now this is another thing that I actually see as a big no sometimes in cases, because this function does multiple things. And while that can be fine, a lot of times, a lot of companies will say, or a lot of code-based managers or whatever will say, your functions do one thing. All right. So this does multiple things. It sets the output property value and accumulate. So it does two things. So maybe that's not bad because it's very descriptive about exactly what it does, because it's probably just accumulating the time and it's setting the output property value. Okay. And it looks like they're passing it by reference, the milliseconds. So this is a variable here, right? And by putting this reference here, it turns it basically into a pointer. So this function wants a pointer to that. That seems a little odd to me. I'm not entirely sure why they would do that. I'd have to dig in a little more, but they probably have the reasons. Because, well, what I'm thinking here is they could, let's think about this. They could take this in by a const reference, right? And then just pass it without having to put this reference thing here, and it would still be very fast. But this function looks like it wants a pointer to an int32, which is going to make a small copy of a pointer rather than passing a reference. They're going to be about the same. The thing is, with this, you could change it. They could change the milliseconds. So maybe that's what they're doing with the accumulate, is they're intending on making a change, and that's why it's not const. But I'd really have to dig into the function to know all this. Now there's a lot more here. I don't know how much I should dig into, and clearly I'm being very critical without knowing the rest of their code and the purpose of it. So it's very, very possible that they are have things written in a very specific manner that I'm not going to understand from a small snippet. But I could tear apart any of this very specifically and tell you exactly what it does. So if you like that sort of stuff, let me know. I'd be happy to review more code and analyze what it does here on this channel. I think a lot of people seem to like that, as far as I can tell. All right, let's move on. Avoid distinction without difference. When possible, without loss of generality, reduce mental tax by prescribing redundant and arbitrary alternatives. I feel mentally taxed reading that. This razor and the following razor go hand in hand. They both deal with our ability to spot differences. You can write a particular behavior in code multiple ways, and sometimes the difference between them is unimportant. Yeah, I agree. Okay, when that happens, we'd rather remove the potential for the difference from the code base so that readers don't need to recognize it. It costs brain power to map multiple things to the same concept. Okay, yeah, I see. So by eliminating these unnecessary differences, we can streamline the reader's ability to pick up code patterns and mentally process at a glance. The infamous example of this is tabs versus spaces for indentation, or bracket starting on a new line or not. All right, it doesn't really matter what you choose at the end of the day, but the choice needs to be made to avoid mixed formatting. Yes, exactly. Yeah, the thing that makes it unreadable is, like, you might all be using the same editor that kind of abstracts your tabs and spaces so that they all have the same thing. But then when you say push it to GitHub or something, GitHub does like 8 spaces for tabs. So then everything that you had aligned perfectly for everybody, once they look at it online, it all looks real wonky and out of place. That's actually the main reason I personally like spaces, is because you never know if a tab is going to be 4 spaces or if it's going to be 8 spaces on whatever you're looking at. So all this careful alignment you do to make things look neat and clean gets thrown out the window as soon as you start using tabs, and that's sort of annoying. But in the reality of things, a tab is a /t, right? So the /t is only 2 characters, and usually when people use spaces, they use 4 spaces, which is 4 characters. So the code is a bit smaller when you're just using /t rather than 4 spaces as far as like size of the file. But also, instead of tabs, you can use 2 spaces, which is the same size as the /t. That's what I tend to do. I just use 2 spaces. I never use 4 spaces. I'm a 2-space indenter. Don't at me. Okay, let's move on. Use American English spelling. Color instead of color. Okay. Post increment in general usage instead of pre-increment. Okay, yeah, that's fine. You'll see for loops, for example, use either. It's the same in a for loop because it happens on a line on its own anyway. Okay, we have these symbols, star and ampersand, which is pointer memory stuff. All right, go next to the variable instead of the type name. Now, I've heard an argument for it being on the left side. All right, so for example, you can declare variables. All right, so int32 star my pointer, and then you can comma and declare another one like a thing or my pointer 2 or whatever. But what this looks like at a quick glance is it looks like this one is a pointer to an int32 and this one is just an int32, but that's not the case. These are both pointers. So when you have it on the left side like this, it's a little more clear that they're both int32 pointers. I tend to stick with it on the left side instead of the right side, but it's not that big of a deal. You just gotta be careful about that. Miscellaneous whitespace rule in high-level code organization within a file. Now, most code checkers will clean up miscellaneous whitespace. So, like if you have just random whitespace at the end of a line, most things will clean that up. At least Visual Studio does, which is nice. All right, and number 3 of the razor stuff, leverage visual consistency. Use visually distinct patterns to convey complexity and signpost hazards. The opposite hand of the previous razor. Now we want differences to indicate important concepts to really stand out. This aids the code reader. Okay, so they want something, we'll say drastic, to kind of happen when there's a big thing happening in the code. Is probably what they're saying. They don't want to try to obscure important things that are happening in a line. So they basically don't want you to miss something that you wouldn't want to miss, which makes sense. Example of something we want really noticeable. In C++, we can use the preprocessor to remove sections of code from being compiled based on whether they're building an internal version only of the game or not. We'll typically have a lot of debug utilities embedded within the game that are unnecessary when we ship. So those will be removed when we compile for retail. Okay, yeah. We want to make sure that the code meant to be shipped doesn't accidentally get marked as internal only, though. Otherwise, we'd get bugs and that would manifest in the retail environment. Those aren't very fun to deal with. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So this is pretty standard, I think, for code bases. Let's see. We mitigate this by making the C++ preprocessor directives really obvious. We use all uppercase names for defined switches. Left align our preprocessor commands and make them stand out against the flow of the rest of the code. Yeah, this is all very standard. So as you can see, their if def is all the way to the left here, even though it's only affecting something in this function. Some people might align it with the rest of the code, but all the way to the left. And it looks like they do a comment here to specify what it's ending here. This is what I do too. Yeah, I think it's better that way. Okay. Some Bungie code guidelines that support this are: braces should always be on their own line, clearly denoting the nest and logic. I guess that is a point. If you have a really long line, putting a bracket way at the end might be off screen. So you might not necessarily know that it's starting a new scope unless you see it, but putting it on a new line makes it very clear. Uppercase for preprocessor symbols, platform 164, okay. No space left of the assignment operator. Okay, we saw that earlier, where there's no space here. Okay, and if they're doing a comparison, there is a space. So that's sort of interesting. I actually kind of like that, because this makes it very clear that it's a comparison, and this is an assignment. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense in a big code base, because a very common error, very, very common, and I've done it a million times, is you make an if statement, all right, and you want to check something, right? Yeah, so you go if, or 42. 42 is a good number. And we want to know if it's 42 or not. So normally you would do this, right? And then you have your logic for if it's 42. But some people accidentally forget this sometimes, forget the second equals, and they do this. So they think, okay, I just want to check if it's 42. This should be doing it. And then their code's buggy and it's not doing what they expect. And they're like, what the heck is wrong with this? This will 100% of the time evaluate to true, because it's setting value to 42, and it will stay 42. For example, if this was 20 and we wanted it to skip over, it's not going to skip over this. Instead, it's going to assign 42 to value, and that's going to be a true because 42 is true. The only false value is 0. This would evaluate to true 100% of the time, and also assign value to 42. So that's just a really common and very easy to make mistake. So if you're not paying a lot of attention, or if your editor doesn't point things like that out to you, most of the modern ones will pick this up and like underline it and be like, I don't think you mean to do this here. You just need the double equals, but it makes it a little more obvious when it's like this, that it's assigning. Leverage pointer operators to advertise memory indirection instead of references. To advertise memory indirection instead of references. Okay. I actually need an example for that. I don't know what they mean by to advertise memory indirection instead of references. It's not clicking for me exactly what they mean by that, because they have all three of the options there. All right, avoid misleading abstractions. When hiding complexity, signpost characteristics that are important for the customer to understand. The customer? What do they mean by the customer? Isn't it only your internal coders working on that? Are you calling them customers? But this just seems weird to call your employees customers. So avoid misleading abstractions. Yeah, I think this is just like a kind of a common sense thing. You don't want to call a function something completely different than what it actually does. You don't want to call a function, say you want a function to maybe resize an object. You don't want to call that function blow up, and right? Because someone's going to look at that and think, oh, you're exploding an object. And no, it's just resizing. So weird example, I know, but so just make things clear. Basically, they're kind of saying the same thing here as they said earlier with the use clear names type thing. Okay, but no, they go on to explain a little more here. I might not be totally right about that. Okay, so they have class types. Start with C, enums start with E, M for member variables, K for constants. So they start things with these. Okay, yeah, that's not a bad convention. I guess it depends what your editor is like, because a lot of editors you can just basically like hover over your variable and it'll tell you all about it. But in giant code bases, the problem with that is that kind of stuff gets really slow. So often you have to turn it off once you have like thousands and thousands of lines of code. You might get slowed down by your checking stuff. Your static analysis, I think is what they call it. So you might want to turn that off once your code base is huge if you're getting tired of it freezing and locking up and not working right and stuff. All right, no operator overloading for non-standard functionality. Probably a good idea. Function names should have obvious implications. Get blank should have a trivial cost. Try to get blank may fail, but will do so gracefully. Compute blank and query blank are expected to have a non-trivial cost. Okay. Favor patterns that make the code more robust. It's desirable to reduce the odds that future change or conflicting change in another branch introduces a non-obvious bug. Yeah, this is kind of a big deal with a lot of people working on a big code base. Merge conflicts can be a complete nightmare if you're, especially during crunch time where everybody's like doing stuff very quickly and suddenly the main merge point gets locked up and then nobody can do anything until that's fixed, and that can get real bad. So just write perfectly logical code and no bugs will happen easy, right? Well, yeah, it's not that easy. All right. So here's some of their coding guidelines. Initialize variables at declaration time. I totally agree with this. You should always do this. I know some people will argue that, well, it initializes to 0 anyway or whatever. Sometimes it switches if you're in like debug or release mode, or if you use a different compiler, if you're supporting multiple systems, it might not initialize to what you think it's going to initialize to. So yeah, always initialize. I think is a good rule. Follow const correctness principles for class interfaces. I don't know. I don't know why this would be a guideline. Maybe there's something I'm not thinking of here, but const correctness is like, it is a standard of C++. Basically, you always want to follow const correctness. I'm not sure why they'd need a guideline for that. It's more like just, yeah, something you do in general. Single return statement at the bottom of the function. All right, that's pretty good for clarity. I'm guilty of not doing this. I often have like returns right at the beginning if something fails or something like that, but it depends what you're doing. A single return at the bottom's probably a good call. It's definitely a little cleaner. You don't have to search through the rest of the function for like, oh, is it possibly returning somewhere else? Is there a reason why it's not getting to where, stuff like that. Leverage asserts to validate state. Okay, so they just assert, it looks like. If it's going to fail, then it's just going to fail the assert and crash anyway. All right, avoid native arrays and use our own containers. That's probably a good idea. The native arrays are a little dangerous, especially if slightly misused and you run off the edge of the memory. All right, centralized lifecycle management. Distribution lifecycle across systems with different policies makes it difficult to reason about correctness when composing systems and behaviors. Instead, leverage the shared toolbox and idioms. Avoid managing your own lifecycle whenever possible. Okay, sure, let's dig in a little bit. Instead of each engineer needing to come up with their own way of managing memory, we have a bunch of tools already written. It can be used as a drop-in solution. Okay, so they're all just doing the same thing, basically. They don't want everybody trying their own methods and things getting lost in translation and stuff like that. All right, some Bungie coding guidelines that support this razor are use engine-specific allocation patterns. Do not allocate memory directly from the operating system. Avoid using STL for game code. No standard template library? I guess they have their own, so that's fine. All right, recap. They have a little recap here. I'm not going to go over the recap, but hey, looks like they're hiring over on their career page. So if this kind of stuff interests you, you could go apply. Wow, what a post. Thank you, Bungie, for supplying this to the general public. It's very cool that they release something like this. You don't see stuff like this out too often in the wild. So yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you think. Leave your comments down below. I'll see you guys next time. And also, a few quick announcements in case you haven't heard. The Patreon's back up and running. We're going to be giving member shout-outs in every video. The amount of times I've been trolled by my phone in this video. There's a new tier that will get you in contact with me on a semi-regular basis if you want like tutoring or me to review your stuff or something like that. There's also a Discord for that sort of thing where we have other members and everyone's super cool there. And yeah, so join up, unite, let's do things. And there's probably more announcements that I'm not thinking of, so I guess just stay tuned. Peace out, guys.